I mean, look, I think we're all making a sort of a bigger thing than it is that she has spoken far more forcefully and passionately about the plight of Palestinians during this war, far more than Biden does. And that's a notable difference, let's say. But policy-wise, it is not a different policy.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Kamala Harris did not have an extensive foreign policy track record before becoming vice president. And as vice president, she did not assume much of a foreign policy portfolio during the Biden administration. So what could we expect from a Kamala Harris foreign policy? How might it be the same or different from a Joe Biden foreign policy? And if Harris becomes president, who might assume some senior foreign policy roles like Secretary of State and National Security Advisor? Joining me to discuss these questions and more is Alexander Ward, a national security reporter who starts at the Wall Street Journal next week and author of The Internationalists, the fight to restore American foreign policy after Trump. This is a vital book which tells the story of the first 2 years of the Biden administration's foreign policy. We kick off discussing what role, if any, Harris played in the two major events that Alexander Ward details in his book, the American withdrawal from Afghanistan and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We then discuss what sort of foreign policy vision can be deduced from Kamala Harris's time as vice president and senator from California. I always enjoy speaking with Alex Ward, and it's a good opportunity to once again plug his book, The Internationalists, and we did a whole episode focusing on his book when it came out a few months ago. And before we begin, I wanted to update listeners to a story we covered a few months ago on the podcast, which were efforts by the government of the Republic of Georgia to pass a law that would restrict the activities of NGOs and civil society more broadly under the rubric of foreign agents laws that are common in Russia and in Hungary as well. This was very much a sign of democratic backsliding in an otherwise key ally of the United States. Well, on July 31st, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, made good on a pledge to suspend aid to Georgia should these so-called anti-democratic policies continue to be enacted. And with the stroke of a pen on July 31st, the United States is pausing more than $95 million in assistance that directly benefits the government of Georgia, says the State Department. Democratic backsliding apparently has consequences. To learn more about this situation, to understand the context in which these actions were taken, please do check out that episode from our archives. It's still freely available wherever you get your podcasts. Now here is my conversation with Alexander Ward, soon-to-be national security reporter for the Wall Street Journal. So, Alex, your book describes in pretty exquisite detail the debate surrounding the two big foreign policy challenges of the first half of the Biden administration, the Afghanistan withdrawal and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What role, if any, did Kamala Harris play in those debates?
If you read the book, you'll notice that Vice President Harris is clearly missing. And it wasn't by any sense of oversight or, not wanting to add her to the narrative. It was just no one I spoke with really gave me a sense of what she was doing. Absent is too strong, but there was no sort of discernible foreign policy vision that she had that really moved away from Biden's. Now, they would say she asked great questions. That's the prosecutor in her. She would always, try to probe and get to the core of the issue during Situation Room meetings, or it may be, but she wasn't necessarily like pulling or pushing Biden in one way. So really at the end of the day, Biden, I mean, obviously he's the president, but at the end of the day, Biden was just kind of making his own choices, kind of independent of where Harris was. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, his deputy John Feiner, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, those guys are far more important in the formulation and the execution of a Biden foreign policy than Harris. I kept asking a bunch of people, okay, but like, what did the vice president think? Where was she at? What was she advising Biden? And people were either like, I don't know, or nothing new, that she was mostly just kind of backing whatever Biden believed, but trying to always ask the right questions in meetings to ensure that whenever a decision was taken, it was done with, all the information available to them. So I guess if she played any role, it was just being another, pair of ears and eyes for Biden to make sure that when he made his call, that he had everything that he needed. But she wasn't necessarily, and she isn't even today, really pushing Biden in a wholly different foreign policy direction.
I mean, that does make sense to the extent that she came to office with a, rather thin foreign policy record, right? I mean, she came up through domestic, California politics of San Francisco, whereas, Biden was like probably the most experienced foreign policy president coming into office since George H.W. Bush, who served as UN ambassador and CIA director before he was vice president like Biden for 8 years. So, he wasn't looking to like expand his foreign policy expertise when he selected Kamala Harris.
No, that's right. In full fairness to her, if you are you're the vice president. We just can't forget that that's her role. But also, if you're going to try to save your bullets to push Biden in one way or the other, you're probably not going to do that on foreign policy, right? Biden's mind is pretty much made up on a lot of those issues. You're going to save your ammo on issues that you probably care more about, mostly in the domestic realm. So I sort of get that from a strategic perspective. That said, I mean, she did serve on the Senate Intelligence Committee. She took some pretty strident foreign policy views while in the Senate. I mean, she effectively called for a reorientation of the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia. Granted, Biden said he would make Saudi a pariah and did not do that as president. And obviously, neither did Harris as vice president. But that could obviously just be, a decision she wasn't necessarily a part of. She called for a change in the special relationship status between the U.S. and Hong Kong since China's crackdown on that city. She has called for greater punishments for Chinese officials who are responsible for the crackdown on Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. So it's not like she hasn't taken some big positions. Again, I just think, one, she's the vice president, and two, there's really no value in trying to change Biden's mind on foreign policy because it is just simply hard to do. I mean, even if his most trusted aides, right, Blinken and Sullivan, don't really try to do that. I mean, it's sort of well known that if you're going to try to change Biden's mind on something, you need to sort of launch a months-long campaign, and Harris doesn't have that kind of time or patience. She'd rather do that on other issues.
So to the extent that Harris, as vice president, had like a foreign policy portfolio, I mean, look, she did represent the U.S. at, say, like APEC or at ASEAN. She did have some foreign policy roles. Like, what were they? And is there any like coherence between the kind of foreign policy roles that she assumed or was given in this administration?
I mean, what she was mainly given were the speeches at the Munich Security Conference, which is a vice president's remit, right? So she goes there to say the U.S. stands with Ukraine, we will punish Russia, we love our allies. And then she was given the quote-unquote root causes of immigration, so dealing with the Northern Triangle issues in Central America. That bit she didn't really get to do much on. Immigration, such a hot wire issue. She's got 1,000 things going on. And also, it's not really something that a vice president can do on their own. I mean, there's tons of issues to solve for why a bunch of people in Latin America want to come northward. But it's very clear that Republicans are going to slam her for the border, right? I mean, they call her the border czar. The media shorthand for it. Now the administration is saying, well, she wasn't officially that. And like, fine, that was not her official title, but they never called for a correction in many years. Now they are because it's politically expedient. Yeah. But that was a title, an informal title she effectively accepted for a while. And then, she's been going to the Indo-Pacific region for quite some time. When she was named as vice president, or I guess the vice president pick for Biden, there were a bunch of folks thinking she would actually care a lot more about the U.S.-India relationship because of her background. Her mother is Indian and maybe would do more with the Caribbean because her father's Jamaican. That just hasn't panned out. Again, a vice president's remit is far more than just their personal views. They have to serve a president. But truly, like, it has not been a foreign policy heavy vice presidency. We're somewhat colored by the like Dick Cheney era where he effectively ran foreign policy, but like that just isn't what vice presidents do.
Or the Obama era when, Joe Biden was a key player in foreign policy debates. I mean, Obama famously ignored his advice on Afghanistan, but he was always in the room, like giving the advice and like making arguments and presenting his case. But again, he was hired as vice president in part because of his foreign policy record.
And Obama empowered him, right, to do Iraq, Afghanistan, or some parts of Afghanistan, et cetera. But that has just not been Biden's MO here. Other than giving Harris like the Northern Triangle, it just hasn't really been a foreign policy. And I guess the speeches in Munich just has not been a very foreign policy heavy vice presidency.
So on the Gaza crisis, what sticks out to you about how she may distinguish herself or not from Biden's policy?
I mean, look, I think we're all making a sort of a bigger thing than it is that she has spoken far more forcefully and passionately about the plight of Palestinians during this war, far more than Biden does. And like, that's a notable difference, let's say. But policy-wise, it is not a different policy. She is still supporting Israel's right to defend itself. She is still supporting Israel's war on Hamas. She is still seeking a ceasefire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, none of that is different. And, she was a very pro-Israel senator when she was there. I mean, she spoke at AIPAC very often. She would meet personally with Bibi Netanyahu. In her, political story, she talked about raising money for a charity that would fund the settler movement. Like, that is her background. But in this case, it is clear that she is the leader of this administration that is far more willing to talk about the human rights angle of this conflict than, say, Biden, right? She was the first one to even say the word ceasefire, although it was heavily couched in the rhetoric of it would just be a 6-week pause, et cetera. And obviously, Hamas needs to make the deal and Israel should still defend itself. But even so, the tone and the messaging does ring harder because of how forcefully she talks about the human rights angle. But that's a messaging thing. Policy-wise, there's really not much daylight, if at all, with Biden.
So, you're kind of describing a almost like tabula rasa foreign policy person. I mean, presumably, she does have these kind of core values that are consistent with most Democrats in the United States, like a multilateralist, a liberal internationalist, transatlanticist. But unlike Biden, who is very set in his ways and has developed over 50 years, just kind of core foreign policy beliefs and ideas of how the U.S. should operate in the world, that Kamala Harris is persuadable. And to the extent that she is persuadable, I'm interested in learning from you, who is in her foreign policy universe that has her ear on some of these key foreign policy questions. Could you just kind of map the Kamala Harris foreign policy universe for me?
It's sort of unknown. I do think the Harris foreign policy is the Biden foreign policy, right? In terms of her worldview right now, alliances are important. Defend the liberal international order, uphold international law, or at least say that you will, and defend it. If it changes generally, it might be more in adopting technologies, and it might be, or, pushing forward on the supply chain stuff, incorporating AI and other things into national security strategy. There might be a greater focus on the African continent, in part because of, she traveled there, et cetera. And also because the administration has sort of pointed at the continent as an important strategic issue, but one that Biden has barely cared about. But that's obviously just me forecasting, but who knows? But to your point, a lot of her foreign policy will be based on personnel. And look, the Harris foreign policy universe is relatively small. I mean, right now, everyone is focusing on Phil Gordon, her current national security advisor, as someone who could play a big role because by virtue of him being the national security advisor now, he might be in the future. Lest we forget, Jake Sullivan, was Biden's national security advisor when Biden was vice president, as was Tony Blinken, who of course now is Secretary of State. So
on Phil Gordon, though, that is a name that I do see popping up often now that Kamala Harris is far more in the spotlight. Who is he? What's his background to the extent that you know?
Yeah, I mean, he was a top State Department official focusing on Europe. He joined the Obama NSC working on the Middle East. He wrote a book which basically called for the U.S. to stop being involved in regime change politics in the Middle East. And that's led some people to say that he's a restrainer. He is by no means a restrainer. He is still an avid internationalist. He just basically wants a lesser role for the U.S. in the Middle East, which would effectively track the Biden administration's overall view, although, of course, they got sucked into the Israel-Hamas conflict. But he could play a big role now. In what space? Who knows? Could it be National Security Advisor, Secretary of State? Could it be something else? Like, we don't really know. But, everyone sort of would believe that he will be in that universe. And he was on her campaign, right, in 2020. So Phil Gordon is not necessarily of like the Biden ilk. He is of the Harris ilk. So one would expect him to be rewarded with something. There are also other people out there like Haley Seufer, who runs a Jewish Democratic group, worked on foreign policy for Harris in the Senate. Rebecca Bill Chavez, who also, is in the Harris universe and works on Latin America issues. But frankly, one has to imagine that Harris will basically pull from not only just the top echelon of the Democratic Party, but also some folks from the Biden universe too, because those are the folks she's most worked with over the last 4 years. Does that mean Senator Chris Coons, who not so secretly was hoping to be Secretary of State in the Biden too? Could he be pulled in maybe to have some continuity? He's also a guy who cares about Africa very deeply. Does she pull from a more progressive wing, maybe like a Chris Murphy from Connecticut? Who knows? It also depends on what the Senate makeup is.
I like it. Both Chris Coons and Chris Murphy have been on this podcast.
So there you go. So again, I'm just, we're all just throwing names at this point. But I think generally speaking, there is no like big Harris foreign policy pool. There is some, but mostly I think it will be either pulled from like the big names of the Democratic Party or Biden universe folks. And one name that I have no evidence for this, it's sort of been ringing in my ears. One has to mention like an Ivo Daalder, right? A former NATO ambassador.
Also a former guest on this very podcast.
There you go. So it's all part of, really, you're the universe.
Really, you have to, it's part of the job interview, I think.
There you go. You got to do it. So, just because he's been such a Biden advisor and, knows the Ukraine issue well, et cetera, I could imagine him having some top role, but that is totally out of thin air.
Just bottom line, hearing from you, not surprisingly, I'm not shocked by your assessment that we can expect just a whole lot of continuity between a Biden foreign policy and a Harris foreign policy. Are there any kind of changes at the margins you might foresee on any issue? Say in particular on China, which we haven't really touched on yet. Is there anything that you might see potentially different from, say, Biden's a little more maybe protectionist instincts on this question than Kamala Harris has?
It's tough, right? We're really just guessing. I want to be very clear about that. We're all just kind of guessing here. One possibility is that because of her time in California and San Francisco in particular, and also running, being senator from California, she might have some more sympathy towards Silicon Valley's views towards China, in which case maybe business opens up a little bit. Maybe there's a bit more going in the weeds on what the future of tech and national security might mean. But I can't imagine she reverses much or any of sort of the Biden policy of restricting, exports of significant national security items to China. She might speak out more forcefully on China's human rights abuses, right? Biden did that initially, but then backed off because he didn't want tensions between the U.S. and China to boil over. And look, it's pretty clear that the main reason the U.S. has been much slower, although it's helped Ukraine immensely, slower in lifting restrictions or sending certain weapons, has been in large part because Biden just fears a World War III. It's not to say that Harris doesn't fear a World War III, but it's possible she'll be less cautious on that, right? This is just sort of Biden's whole view that he still thinks there are ways to muddle through. Maybe Harris goes, look, it's been 4 years. The Russians have shown no signs of slowing down. Why would we slow down? So that's a possibility. We'll see marginal change if that, but personnel is policy too. Just to throw this out there, if it were to be, let's say, a Secretary of State Chris Murphy, one could imagine that he would push for a harder line against the Saudis, right? And that would appeal to at least 2020 Kamala Harris, and maybe this grand deal to get Saudi involved in the Abraham Accords, or at least be a real friend of the United States and to eschew China, maybe that goes away. I don't know. It all depends. But I really would expect far, far, far more continuity than change, at least at the start of a Harris administration, if that were to come. But who knows what they get surprised by, right, during those 4 years, in which case, you could see more change then. But all things being equal, I think it would almost be a continuation of the Biden administration on foreign policy.
We'll leave it there. Thank you. This was really helpful.
Good. I'm glad. Thanks for having me on again.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.